One of the things I fight on this committee, and also as the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee with others in the world, is about intellectual property rights. Because it's no value to have great American ingenuity create a product and then have it arbitrarily and capriciously stolen globally and not compensated for it. So do you think the intellectual property objectives as delineated in the bill would provide the type of adequate protection of companies like yours and other American companies as it relates to intellectual property?
I can't say I'm expressly knowledgeable of exactly what the provisions are in the bill and what they do. But I would say, in general, I'm very supportive of anything that increases IP compliance around the world. And like the discussion we had on corruption, I think the lack of protection on IP hurts a country over time. And I can say that we are extremely careful about where we develop IP around the world. And the safer it is, the greater the chance that we can protect it. And we don't go to places that don't protect it.
Well, I hear from many American companies and many New Jersey companies, which has an enormous innovative capacity, about the nature of how countries, many in trade agreements that we have, or on WTO and others, ultimately still with rather, arbitrary and capriciously go ahead and constantly violate intellectual property rights. And one of the concerns that I have is what standards do we create, not only, and what enforcement mechanisms do we have? Because at the end of the day, regardless of what agreements we enter to, it's only the enforcement of those agreements that make it valuable. Otherwise, as in any law, there's very little value to the agreement if you don't really seek enforcement. So that's one of the things I'm going to be looking at here, because I think the distinguished chairman has been nominated to be the ambassador to China. There's a place that has, probably at the top of the list of entities that consistently take American products and innovation and, just violate it left and right. So that's a huge problem. I want to ask, I know this has been asked in general, and I think your answer was a consideration as a panel, but a recent study by the Peterson Institute of Economics estimates that currency manipulation has cost between 1 and 5 million U.S. jobs, increased the U.S. current account deficit by $200 to $500 billion. And, given that current manipulation has an impact at least as great as any provision of a trade agreement, and that venues such as the IMF and the G20 have failed to resolve this issue to date, wouldn't any true high-standard 21st century agreement have to include some type of binding provision on currency manipulation to ensure that benefits from trade that should accrue to the United States are not undermined by a country's effort to artificially weaken its currency?
Yeah, I would underscore that and say that, as I mentioned earlier, I think currency manipulation in TPA, labor standards, environmental standards, and making it clear that our consumer rights at the federal, state, and local level can't be abridged are really the core for TPA, as well as we need to anticipate what are the likely results in terms of jobs, the standard of living, and the deficit itself that you mentioned for this nation. Those should be the core priorities as we move forward.
Anyone else have a view on that?
From my perspective, I'm all in favor of a level playing field in general on everything, because I really do believe that with market access and a level playing field, American companies do a very good job of winning. That being said, I can't say that while I have to be conscious of currency, as I mentioned earlier, currency manipulation, I can't say, I would be hard-pressed to point to a decision I've made or any results in the company that have been impacted by it. So it's not even on my, I would say, top 10 worry list.
Well, maybe as an individualized company, I could understand that, but as a collective, when I see 1 to 5 million jobs, U.S. jobs, and $200 to $500 billion, it certainly, even in this town, it raises a light for me. Finally, Mr. Chairman, if I may, what's the difference between the answer you gave, Mr. Cote, earlier about that these trade opportunities is an opportunity to raise the standards across the board, including on labor. And the position that Mr. Cohen has that, yes, we support trade, but there should be ILO standards. Is there a difference between your two views?
Well, it sounds to me like there's not that much of a difference in how we're saying it, but there's probably a difference in terms of how far we'd go to implement it. Because I do think it's important to try to raise the standards around the world, but I also think it's a question of degree. And at what point do you look at something and say, this is a walkaway versus, okay, this is something that I have to work through, and this advances the world, advances the U.S., and this is as good as we can get at this point. So I'd say it's more a question of degree.
And I would say that as important as it would be to raise standards, we're actually faced here with unraveling what we have done. And so the race to the bottom, as I've said, gravity takes us there. Because in an economic world workplace, if there's not minimum standards that are enforceable, that's where you lower production costs and create profits. And so we must do that, is our view. It does no good to have even talking about a higher minimum wage in this country if to have production occur in the U.S., Honeywell or anything else, a decision is made, how much does it cost in Vietnam and how much does it cost in Trenton or Camden? It doesn't do us any good if we're not establishing some kind of minimums about children doing it, about workers with no rights doing it. So, you know, we would say quite passionately, whether it's our environment, our workforce, or our rights as consumers, we must maintain and increase those standards or they will sink into oblivion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.